Sign them, Olivia. It's over.
Is this what you really want?
It's what's best for everyone.
You have no idea what you've done.
Hospital monitors beeped steadily as Olivia Bennett accepted the divorce papers her husband Christopher was forcing into her hands. Her pregnant form fragile after 3 days of stress following the moment his mother had physically kicked her out of their home. Margaret Bennett had screamed that Olivia was manipulative, that her pregnancy was convenient, and that no self-respecting family would tolerate such obvious gold digging. But Margaret's recent home renovation had been financed through a construction loan that Olivia's shell company had underwritten at favorable terms. See, Sterling National Bank was processing Christopher's emergency loan request at that very moment, a desperate measure to save his pharmaceutical consultancy from the fraud investigation that was draining his legal defense fund. Yet the bank's owner was lying in a hospital bed, being mocked by his mistress Taylor. Olivia had spent 5 years playing the role of supportive wife, never mentioning that her net worth exceeded $1.3 billion, never revealing that her modest job at a nonprofit was actually running a foundation she'd created, and never exposing that Christopher's lucky breaks in business were her carefully orchestrated interventions. His sister Hannah entered the hospital room with their family attorney, her voice dripping with disdain as she called Olivia a leech who'd contributed nothing but problems to their family, unaware that the trust fund she'd been living off had been replenished by Olivia's investment advice to their father before his death. Christopher had met Olivia 6 years ago at a charity event she was hosting, but he'd assumed she was just another attendee, never questioning why someone so young would be commanding a room full of billionaires. Taylor's hand rested possessively on Christopher's arm as she suggested Olivia would be crawling back begging within a month, blind to the fact that the designer handbag she carried was from a brand Olivia's investment firm owned 30% of. Hannah's repetition of the word leech was the final straw, not because it hurt Olivia's feelings, but because it gave her legal documentation of defamation she'd need later. The Bennett family had never asked where their sudden reversals of fortune came from, never questioned why disaster always somehow missed them, and never bothered to investigate the quiet woman who'd married into their family. But they were about to discover that kicking out the pregnant wife they dismissed would bankrupt them all and leave Christopher trembling in fear. How long could a family remain blind to the woman who'd been protecting them? And what would happen when the husband who handed his pregnant wife divorce papers in the hospital learned she was the secret trillionaire owner of the bank he'd begged for mercy? What this story teaches, this narrative teaches about the danger of entitlement, the hidden dynamics of power and protection in families, and how people's true nature emerges when they believe someone is vulnerable. It educates on strategic wealth management, the testing of character before revelation, and the inevitable consequences of betraying those who love you. What viewers will benefit from? Learning that appearances can be deliberately deceiving for good reason, understanding how arrogance and cruelty create their own downfall, recognizing the signs of hidden power and silent support, discovering why investigating before judging is crucial, gaining insight into how treating vulnerable people reveals your true character. Dear viewers, have you ever been underestimated by people who should have valued you? This story reveals the devastating cost of judging others by appearance and treating family with cruelty. You'll discover how silent strength can be more powerful than loud arrogance, why testing people's character protects you from betrayal, and how entitlement blinds us to those who truly support us. Watch what happens when a powerless pregnant wife reveals she controlled everything all along. Drop in the comments. What lessons did you learn? What would you have done if you were Olivia? Subscribe for more captivating, life-changing stories that teach powerful lessons. The fluorescent lights in Memorial Hospital's maternity ward cast harsh shadows across Olivia Bennett's face as she struggled to sit upright in the bed, her 28-week pregnant belly making every movement a calculated effort. Christopher stood at the foot of the bed with his arms crossed, his 6'2" frame blocking the window that overlooked the city skyline. A skyline dotted with buildings Olivia's real estate investment trust had quietly acquired over the past decade, but he'd never know that from looking at her now. Taylor Martinez, his mistress of 8 months, leaned against the wall near the door, wearing a crimson dress that cost $3,000, though she'd told Christopher it was a discount find, and her eyes tracked Olivia's every movement with the predatory focus of someone who'd already mentally redecorated the Bennett mansion. The divorce papers lay on Olivia's lap like a death sentence, 18 pages of legal terminology that Christopher's attorney had rushed to prepare after Margaret Bennett's explosive confrontation 3 nights ago. But what none of them understood was that Olivia had been expecting this moment for 6 months. Christopher's phone buzzed in his pocket, the 4th time in 20 minutes, and each vibration represented another creditor demanding payment, another business partner threatening to pull out of deals, another consequence of the fraud investigation that had begun when a former employee reported irregularities in his pharmaceutical consulting contracts. "Just sign the papers." "Olivia," Christopher said, his voice carrying that particular tone of exhausted patience he'd perfected during their marriage, the one that made her feel small and unreasonable for having emotions. "We both know this pregnancy was your way of trying to secure your position in the family, but my mother saw through it immediately." The accusation hung in the air between them, sharp and cutting, yet Olivia's hand remained steady as she reached for the pen on her bedside table. Not the cheap hospital pen, but the Mont Blanc Christopher had given her on their first anniversary, back when he'd still pretended she mattered. Taylor shifted her weight and smiled. That practiced expression she'd perfected in the mirror before coming to the hospital, the one designed to communicate victory without words. "Again, I told Christopher you'd be difficult about this," Taylor said, her voice sugary sweet with manufactured sympathy that barely concealed her triumph. "But honestly, Olivia, what did you expect? You trapped him with this pregnancy. Everyone knows it." The words should have devastated Olivia, should have reduced her to tears and begging, but instead she felt a strange calm settling over her like a familiar coat. She'd spent 5 years watching these people, studying them, understanding exactly who they were beneath the veneer of sophistication they showed the world, and now she was simply watching the final act of a play she'd written long ago. The hospital room door swung open with enough force to rattle the privacy curtain, and Hannah Bennett stormed in with their family attorney Gerald Richardson, trailing behind her like an anxious shadow. Hannah was 34, 2 years older than Christopher, and she'd spent every year of that advantage reminding him that she'd been Daddy's favorite until the day he died of a heart attack 4 years ago. "I cannot believe we're wasting time on this drama," Hannah announced to the room, her designer heels clicking against the linoleum floor with sharp, staccato beats that matched her clipped tone. "Christopher, just get her signature and let's go. Mom's waiting at the house, and we have actual important matters to discuss about the business." She turned to face Olivia with undisguised contempt, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the fluorescent light as she moved. "You know what you are, Olivia. You're a leech. A parasite who saw an opportunity and latched onto our family, contributing absolutely nothing while draining resources and creating problems." The word hung in the air. Leech. And Olivia felt something shift inside her chest. Not pain, but clarity. Not hurt, but purpose. She looked at Hannah's Cartier watch, the one Olivia had anonymously arranged for Christopher to win in a charity auction so he could give it to his sister for her birthday. She looked at Taylor's designer handbag from a fashion house where Olivia served on the board of directors under a different name. She looked at Christopher's confident posture, the one built on 5 years of professional success he genuinely believed he'd earned through his own merit. Cedia never questioning the mysterious investors who'd appeared at crucial moments or the contracts that had materialized when he needed them most. Gerald Richardson cleared his throat and stepped forward with another copy of the divorce papers, his expensive suit probably paid for, with Bennett family money that wouldn't exist without Olivia's interventions. But he couldn't know that from looking at the pale, exhausted woman in the hospital bed. "I'll sign," Olivia said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, and she watched relief flood Christopher's face. He actually thought he was winning. They all did. Olivia's hand moved across the divorce papers with practiced precision, her signature flowing in blue ink across the designated lines. But her mind was 6 years in the past, standing in the grand ballroom of the Regency Hotel, where she'd hosted the annual Children's Healthcare Foundation Gala. She'd been 26 then, already worth $800 million through a series of strategic investments that had begun with her grandmother's inheritance when she was 19. But nobody at that gala knew her real identity because she'd registered as a foundation representative rather than its founder and primary benefactor. Christopher had been there as a guest of a pharmaceutical executive, networking aggressively in that way ambitious men do when they're convinced their charisma alone will open doors. And he'd approached her near the champagne fountain with a smile that suggested he was doing her a favor by talking to her. "These events are always so stuffy," he'd said, loosening his tie with deliberate casualness that was supposed to make him seem approachable, different from the other corporate climbers in the room. "I'm Christopher Bennett, pharmaceutical consulting. And you are?" She'd told him her name was Olivia Sterling, using her grandmother's maiden name instead of the Morrison that appeared on her corporate documents. And she'd let him assume she was someone's assistant, someone forgettable, someone safe. The attraction had been real despite the deception. Christopher had been charming that night, genuinely funny in his observations about the pompous speeches and overpriced auction items. And when he'd asked for her number at the end of the evening, she'd given it to him with the reckless hope that maybe this man could love her for herself rather than her money. Their first date had been coffee at a small cafe in the Arts District, where Christopher had insisted on paying despite her gentle protest, his gesture making him feel chivalrous and her feel cautiously optimistic. Their second date had been dinner at an Italian restaurant, where he'd talked about his dreams of building a consulting empire that would revolutionize pharmaceutical compliance. And she'd listened with genuine interest because his passion was infectious, even if his business plan had obvious flaws he couldn't see. By their fifth date, Olivia had fallen in love with the version of Christopher who took her to free concerts in the park and talked about changing the world. But she'd also noticed the subtle ways his charm shifted when he felt insecure. The slight edge in his voice when she mentioned her work at the nonprofit, the way his eyes narrowed when other men looked at her with interest, the careful questions about her background that were really assessments of her social value. When he'd proposed 8 months later with a ring that had stretched his budget to its limit, she'd said yes because she wanted to believe love could exist without the corruption of wealth. But she'd also quietly maintained her hidden empire because some part of her knew she might need it. The wedding had been beautiful, paid for by Christopher's family with money Margaret Bennett had inherited from her own parents. Though Olivia had anonymously covered the venue costs through a scholarship program the hotel was running that year. Margaret had made it clear from the beginning that Olivia was marrying up, that the Bennett name carried weight in their social circles, and that Christopher's new wife should be grateful for the opportunity to join such an established family. What Margaret hadn't known was that the Bennett family business, a mid-sized medical equipment distribution company started by Christopher's grandfather, had been weeks away from bankruptcy when Olivia entered the picture. She'd discovered this fact within 2 months of dating Christopher, during a conversation where he'd casually mentioned his father's stress about cash flow issues that were threatening to destroy 40 years of family legacy. Olivia had made a single phone call to her investment manager, and suddenly a new investor had appeared with exactly the capital the Bennett company needed, purchasing enough shares to stabilize operations, but not enough to trigger legal disclosure requirements. Christopher's father had died of a heart attack 6 months after the wedding, never knowing that his company's miraculous recovery had been orchestrated by his daughter-in-law, and the family had mourned him while secretly celebrating their financial resurrection. Hannah had taken over management of the family company with aggressive confidence, in implementing strategies she'd learned from expensive business consultants who'd mysteriously offered their services at reduced rates. Rates Olivia had subsidized through shell companies she controlled. Christopher's own consulting firm had launched 2 years into their marriage, built on connections Olivia had quietly facilitated through her network of pharmaceutical executives who owed her favors. Every major contract Christopher had celebrated as proof of his business acumen had been softly arranged by his wife, who'd made phone calls and sent carefully worded emails to people who understood that helping Christopher Bennett would earn them goodwill with someone far more powerful. Taylor's hand squeezed Christopher's arm now, pulling Olivia back to the present moment, and back to the hospital room where she was signing away her marriage to a man who'd never truly seen her. "There," Olivia said softly, sliding the papers across her lap toward Gerald Richardson. "It's done." Christopher's phone buzzed again, the 7th time, and this time he pulled it from his pocket with visible irritation, his eyes scanning the screen before his face went pale. "What is it?" Hannah demanded, her voice sharp with the instinct of someone who'd built her life on reading people's reactions. Christopher's hand trembled slightly as he lowered the phone, his confidence cracking just enough for doubt to seep through. "Sterling National Bank," he said slowly, his voice carrying a new uncertainty that hadn't been there moments before. "They've rejected my loan application." "But that's impossible. The loan officer said yesterday it was practically approved." Olivia felt the ghost of a smile touch her lips, so slight that nobody in the room could have caught it if they'd been watching. But they weren't watching her anymore. They were all looking at Christopher's phone, at the harbinger of catastrophe none of them had seen coming. Christopher's fingers whitened around his phone as he read the rejection email a second time, his lips moving silently as if speaking the words aloud might change their meaning. But the message remained brutally clear. Sterling National Bank had not only rejected his $2 million emergency loan application, but had also flagged his existing business accounts for immediate review due to irregular financial patterns and undisclosed risk factors. Hannah snatched the phone from her brother's hand with the territorial aggression of someone who'd spent a lifetime managing family crises, her eyes scanning the screen while her jaw tightened with each line she read. "This doesn't make any sense," Hannah said, her voice losing its earlier confidence and taking on the sharp edge of genuine fear. "Sterling National has been our family's primary bank for 15 years. Dad had relationships there. I have relationships there. They don't just reject applications from established clients without warning." Taylor shifted uncomfortably near the door, her earlier triumph evaporating as she recognized the scent of financial disaster, and her hand dropped from Christopher's arm as if physical distance might protect her from whatever was unfolding. Gerald Richardson pulled out his own phone and began typing frantically, his attorney instincts recognizing that rejected loan applications were often the first domino in a cascade of legal and financial consequences. But what he couldn't understand was why this was happening now, at this specific moment, in this hospital room. Olivia remained still in her bed, her hands folded over her pregnant belly, her face carefully neutral as she watched the Bennett family's reality begin to fracture around them. She'd made the call to Sterling National's executive board exactly 47 minutes ago, using the encrypted phone she kept in her hospital bag, and she'd given them very specific instructions about Christopher Bennett's loan application and the subsequent review of all Bennett family accounts. Christopher's phone buzzed again, and this time it was his business partner Marcus Wellington, whose name flashing on the screen made Christopher's face go even paler than before. "Marcus, this isn't a good time," Christopher began, but Marcus's voice erupted from the phone loud enough that everyone in the room could hear it. Panic and fury mixing into a toxic combination that filled the sterile hospital air. "Not a good time? Christopher, our 3 biggest clients just canceled their contracts within the last hour, all of them citing conflict of interest concerns and reputational risk factors that they refuse to specify. What the hell is happening?" Christopher turned away from the bed, his free hand gripping the back of his neck in the gesture Olivia had seen 1,000 times when he was overwhelmed, and his voice came out strangled and desperate. "I don't know, Marcus. I don't understand any of this." But Olivia understood perfectly, because she'd spent the past 3 days in this hospital bed, making very careful, very strategic phone calls to every company, every investor, and every financial institution that had connections to Christopher's business empire. Connections that existed only because she'd created them in the first place. The pharmaceutical executives who'd given Christopher his most lucrative contracts were personal friends of Olivia's, brought into her network during her early 20s, when she'd invested heavily in biotech startups that had made them all wealthy. The venture capitalists who'd funded Christopher's business expansion were portfolio managers at firms where Olivia sat on advisory boards under her corporate identity. The lucky breaks Christopher had experienced throughout his marriage weren't luck at all, but rather carefully orchestrated interventions by a wife who'd loved him enough to build his dreams for him, and now she was systematically dismantling everything she'd created. Hannah's phone rang next, and Olivia watched as Christopher's sister answered with her characteristic impatience, only to have that impatience transform into shock within seconds. "What do you mean the trust fund is frozen?" Hannah demanded into her phone, her voice rising to a pitch that made Taylor wince. "That's my money. Dad left that to me." The voice on the other end spoke for 30 seconds while Hannah's face cycled through disbelief, anger, and finally fear. The kind of fear that comes from realizing your financial security isn't as secure as you'd believed. A lien? There's a lien on my trust fund for outstanding business debts? That's impossible. The family company is profitable. I've seen the quarterly reports. Hannah's eyes darted to Christopher, searching for answers he couldn't provide. And Olivia felt a cold satisfaction watching the Bennett siblings realize their empire was built on foundations far more fragile than they'd ever imagined. Margaret Bennett's name lit up Christopher's phone screen before he could process what was happening with Hannah's trust fund, and his mother's voice pierced through the phone's speaker with aristocratic fury that demanded immediate attention and solutions. Christopher Andrew Bennett, I have just received a notification from my financial advisor that our family investment accounts are being liquidated due to margin calls. He's saying something about collateral obligations and cross-default provisions that make absolutely no sense. Fix this immediately. Christopher's hand shook as he tried to form words, tried to explain something he didn't understand himself, but his voice came out as a strangled whisper that carried no authority. Mom, I'm dealing with something right now. I'll call you back. You will not call me back. Margaret's voice could have cut glass. You will fix this disaster that you've somehow created. Your father built this family's wealth over 40 years, and I will not watch you destroy it because you couldn't keep your personal life from contaminating our business. The call ended abruptly, leaving Christopher staring at his phone like it had transformed into a venomous snake, and the silence in the hospital room was so complete that Olivia could hear the monitor tracking her baby's heartbeat. Steady, strong, unaffected by the chaos unraveling around them. Taylor cleared her throat, her voice small and uncertain in a way that revealed her true character beneath the confident exterior. Christopher, maybe I should go. This seems like family business, and I don't want to intrude. You're not going anywhere, Christopher snapped, his desperation making him cruel in a way that made Taylor flinch, and Olivia recognized the tone as the same one he'd used on her countless times when his stress needed a target. Hannah had moved to the window, her phone pressed against her ear as she argued with someone about frozen accounts and block transfers. Her designer clothing and perfect hair suddenly looking like a costume worn by someone playing at wealth rather than possessing it. Gerald Richardson approached Christopher with the careful movements of someone approaching a wounded animal, or his legal expertise recognizing that his client was spiraling into territory where lawyers couldn't help. Christopher, I think we need to schedule an emergency meeting with your financial team and figure out what's triggering these cascading failures. Cascading failures, Christopher repeated, his laugh bitter and sharp. Is that what we're calling this? His eyes finally found Olivia, still sitting quietly in her hospital bed, and for the first time since entering the room, he really looked at her, not through her or past her, but at her, and something in his expression shifted. You're very calm about all this, he said slowly, suspicion creeping into his voice like poison through water. We just finalized our divorce. My business is imploding. My family's accounts are frozen. And you're sitting there like none of this matters. Olivia met his gaze steadily, her hands still folded over her belly, and she allowed herself the smallest smile. Why would it matter to me, Christopher? According to your sister, I'm just a leech, a parasite who contributed nothing to this family. The words hung between them, and Olivia watched understanding begin to dawn in Christopher's eyes. Not complete understanding yet, but the first terrible glimmer of recognition that perhaps he'd missed something crucial. Hannah turned from the window, her phone call abandoned, and her eyes narrowed as she looked at Olivia with new calculation. What did you do? Hannah asked, her voice low and dangerous. But Olivia simply shook her head gently, as if the question itself was absurd. I didn't do anything, Hannah, Olivia said softly. Well, I'm just a leech, remember? What could someone like me possibly do? Christopher's phone exploded with notifications, 17 messages, 9 missed calls, and 3 emergency emails all arriving within 90 seconds. And each one represented another piece of his carefully constructed world crumbling into dust. His pharmaceutical consulting firm's operating account had been frozen pending investigation into funding source irregularities. His business partner Marcus had just sent a resignation letter, effective immediately, and their largest remaining client had issued a formal statement terminating their contract due to undisclosed conflicts of interest that compromised the integrity of our business relationship. Hannah was frantically calling every contact in her phone, her voice growing more desperate with each conversation as she discovered that the Bennett family company's line of credit had been revoked, their supplier contracts were being canceled, and the stable investors who'd rescued the business 4 years ago were now demanding immediate repayment of convertible notes nobody in the family had known existed. Taylor had moved closer to the door, her designer handbag clutched against her chest like a shield, her eyes calculating the exact moment when staying became more damaging than leaving. And Olivia could see the mistress's brain working through the mathematics of association with financial disaster. Gerald Richardson's phone rang, and he stepped into the hallway to take the call. But his voice carried back through the partially open door as he spoke with someone from the State Bar Association about potential ethics violations related to the Bennett family accounts. Violations he'd had no knowledge of until this moment, but which would still destroy his reputation by proximity. Christopher sank into the chair beside Olivia's hospital bed, his earlier confidence completely evaporated, replaced by the hollow-eyed confusion of someone watching their life disintegrate in real time without understanding why. "This doesn't make sense," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone in the room, his hands trembling as he scrolled through the cascade of bad news on his phone. Everything was fine yesterday. The loan was practically approved. The business was stable. How does everything collapse in a single afternoon? Olivia reached for the water cup on her bedside table, taking a slow sip while she watched Christopher's mind work through the impossibility of coincidence, the statistical improbability that every support structure in his life would fail simultaneously without coordination. "Christopher," she said quietly, her voice carrying a new quality that made everyone in the room turn to look at her. Not the soft, accommodating tone they were used to, but something firmer, something that commanded attention rather than requested it. "Do you remember the charity gala where we met? The Children's Healthcare Foundation event at the Regency Hotel?" Christopher's eyes focused on her with desperate confusion, unable to understand why she was bringing up their first meeting at a moment like this. But he nodded slowly. "You told me that night that you were there networking, trying to make connections that would help you build your consulting business. Do you remember what I told you I did?" "You said you worked for a nonprofit," Christopher answered, his voice hollow, and Olivia smiled. Not kindly, but not cruelly either. Just the sad smile of someone watching a truth unfold that should have been obvious all along. "I said I worked for the Children's Healthcare Foundation," Olivia corrected gently. "I never said I worked for them as an employee. I founded that organization when I was 23 years old, Christopher. I funded it with money from my grandmother's inheritance, an inheritance that was worth $42 million when I received it at 19, and which I'd grown to $800 million by the time we met." The hospital room fell into a silence so complete that the beeping of Olivia's monitors sounded like thunder, and she watched Christopher's face cycle through disbelief, confusion, and the first flickering edges of horrified understanding. "That's impossible," he whispered, but his voice carried no conviction because the pieces were starting to fall into place in his mind. The mysterious investors, the lucky breaks, the doors that had opened at exactly the right moments. Hannah moved away from the window, her phone forgotten in her hand, her face pale as she processed what Olivia was saying. "You're lying," Hannah said, but the words came out weak and unconvincing even to her own ears. "If you had that kind of money, we would have known. There would have been signs. Well, Dad's financial advisors would have found out." Olivia's laugh was soft and utterly without humor, the sound of someone who'd spent 5 years watching people fail to see what was right in front of them. "Your father's financial advisors worked for Morrison Capital Management, Hannah. I own 68% of Morrison Capital Management through a holding company structure that's been in place since I was 25. The mystery investor who saved your family business 4 years ago? That was me. The venture capital firm that funded Christopher's business launch? I sit on their investment committee. Sterling National Bank, where Christopher just applied for his emergency loan?" Olivia paused, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. "I'm the majority shareholder and the chair of the board of directors." Christopher's phone slipped from his hands and clattered against the linoleum floor, the sound sharp and final in the hospital room, And Olivia watched her husband's face as he understood, truly understood, what he'd just done. "The divorce papers you just made me sign," Olivia continued, her voice steady and clear, "legally sever any obligation I have to protect Bennett family interests. The shell companies I use to subsidize your business, fund your mother's lifestyle, and replenish Hannah's trust fund, they're all structured to dissolve upon the termination of my marriage to you. Every contract you thought you'd earn through your own merit was facilitated by my network. Every investor who believed in your vision was actually believing in me." She shifted in the hospital bed, her hand moving to her pregnant belly with protective instinct. "Your mother kicked me out 3 days ago, calling me a manipulative gold digger. Your sister called me a leech who contributed nothing to this family. Your mistress suggested I'd be crawling back begging within a month. And you," her eyes locked with Christopher's, and he flinched from what he saw there, "you handed me divorce papers while I was hospitalized with stress-induced complications from being thrown out of my own home, the home I purchased through a trust that you never bothered to investigate." Taylor made a small sound of distress and bolted from the room, her designer heels clicking rapidly down the hospital corridor as she fled from the disaster she'd helped create. And nobody moved to stop her because they were all frozen in the terrible gravity of revelation. Hannah's phone rang again, but she didn't answer it, just stared at Olivia with an expression that mixed horror with unwilling respect. Understanding finally dawning that the quiet woman they dismissed had been holding all their lives in her hands. "You destroyed us," Hannah whispered, and Olivia shook her head slowly, her expression almost pitying. "No, Hannah. I built you up. I protected you. I gave Christopher every advantage, funded every opportunity, and smoothed every obstacle out of your family's path for 5 years. What you're experiencing now isn't me destroying you. It's me simply stopping to hold you up. Well, this is what the Bennett family looks like without my intervention. This is who you actually are without me." Christopher's face had gone from pale to gray, his breathing shallow as the full magnitude of his mistake crashed over him like a physical weight, and his hands trembled as he reached for the divorce papers that still lay on Olivia's lap. "We can fix this," he said desperately, his voice cracking with panic that made him sound like a stranger. "I'll tear up the papers. We'll say it was a mistake. Olivia, please, I didn't know." But Olivia pulled the papers away from his reaching hands, holding them against her chest with finality that left no room for negotiation. "You didn't know because you never asked, Christopher. In 5 years of marriage, you never once questioned where your good fortune came from. You never wondered why opportunities appeared exactly when you needed them. You accepted everything as your due, as proof of your own excellence, and you never saw me as anything more than the modest wife who was lucky to have married into the Bennett family." Gerald Richardson returned to the room, his face ashen, and he looked at Olivia with dawning recognition and professional horror. "Morrison Capital Management just called my firm," he said slowly, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "They're threatening to file a lawsuit against me personally for malpractice if I was aware of any conflicts of interest in this divorce proceeding. Ms. Bennett, or should I say Ms. Morrison, I had no idea." Olivia waved her hand dismissively, her exhaustion finally showing through the careful control she'd maintained throughout the confrontation. "I know you didn't, Gerald. You were doing your job based on the information Christopher provided, but you should probably advise your client that contesting this divorce will only accelerate his bankruptcy, because every hour he spends in legal proceedings is another hour I'm making phone calls to the people who control his professional fate." Christopher stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor with a sound like a scream, and he began pacing the small hospital room like a caged animal, his hands running through his hair repeatedly as his mind tried desperately to find a way out of the trap he'd built for himself. "This is insane," he said, his voice rising with hysteria he couldn't control. "What, you can't just destroy an entire family because we hurt your feelings. There are laws, there are regulations, there are—" He stopped suddenly, his eyes widening as another realization hit him. "The fraud investigation, the one that's draining my legal defense fund. Did you—" Olivia met his gaze steadily, and her silence was answer enough, but she spoke anyway because she wanted him to understand the completeness of his miscalculation. "I didn't fabricate anything, Christopher. The fraud was real, irregular billing practices, inflated consulting fees, kickback arrangements with pharmaceutical representatives. I just made sure the right people started looking at the right documents. Everything they'll find is authentic evidence of choices you made. Hannah had sunk into the other chair, her phone still clutched uselessly in her hand. Her earlier arrogance completely evaporated and replaced with the numb shock of someone watching their world end. "How long have you been planning this?" she asked, her voice barely audible, and Olivia considered the question carefully before answering. "I wasn't planning it at all, Hannah. I spent 5 years hoping I'd never have to do this. I kept building safety nets for your family, kept protecting Christopher's reputation, kept funding your lifestyle, all because I loved him, and I wanted to believe that eventually he'd see me as an equal partner, rather than a fortunate accessory to his success. But your mother kicked me out while I was pregnant and vulnerable. You called me a leech. Christopher handed me divorce papers in a hospital bed, and all of you stood there watching Taylor mock me, Soja never once questioning whether you might be wrong about who I am." She paused, her hand moving protectively over her belly again. "I didn't plan this revenge, Hannah. You all earned it through 5 years of casual cruelty that you never even recognized as cruelty because you genuinely believed I was beneath you." Christopher's phone rang again, his mother's name flashing on the screen. And this time he answered it, his voice breaking as he tried to explain something he barely understood himself. "Mom, I need you to listen very carefully," he said, and Olivia could hear Margaret's imperious voice demanding immediate solutions through the speaker. "Olivia isn't who we thought she was. She's wealthy, extremely wealthy, and she's been—" He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't admit the magnitude of his delusion, and Margaret's voice rose in pitch and fury as she processed what her son was trying to tell her. "What do you mean she's wealthy? That mousy little nobody who trapped you with a pregnancy? Christopher, if this is some kind of joke." But Christopher was shaking his head, tears streaming down his face now as the full weight of what he'd lost finally crushed through his defenses. "It's not a joke, Mom. We destroyed ourselves. We destroyed everything, and she let us do it." Olivia pressed the call button for the nurse, suddenly exhausted beyond her ability to maintain consciousness, and she looked at Christopher one final time before closing her eyes. "You need to leave now," she said quietly. "You're causing stress that's dangerous for the baby. Your baby, Christopher, whether you believe that or not. I'll have my attorneys send you the financial documentation proving everything I've told you, and then you'll understand exactly what you gave up when you handed me those divorce papers." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight of sadness that was somehow worse than anger. "I loved you enough to build your dreams for you, Christopher, but you loved yourself too much to ever see me clearly. Now you'll spend the rest of your life knowing that the woman you called a gold digger was actually made of gold all along, and you were too blind to notice until it was far too late." The nurse entered the room, took one look at the scene, Olivia's elevated heart rate on the monitor, Christopher's tears, Hannah's shock, and immediately began ushering the Bennett family toward the door with professional efficiency that left no room for argument. Christopher tried to resist, tried to say something more, but Gerald Richardson was already pulling him toward the hallway, whispering urgent legal advice about not making things worse. Hannah followed silently, her phone still clutched in her hand, her eyes distant as she calculated the impossibility of recovery from this kind of exposure. And then they were gone, the hospital room door swinging shut behind them, leaving Olivia alone with the beeping monitors and the baby growing inside her. The child who would inherit an empire its father had never known existed. Olivia opened her eyes and looked at the divorce papers still clutched against her chest, and Christopher's signature and her own making the document legally binding, and she felt something that wasn't quite triumph and wasn't quite grief, but rather the strange emptiness that comes from winning a game you'd never wanted to play. She reached for her phone and pulled up the encrypted app that controlled her business empire, scrolling through the messages from her executive team, confirming that every instruction had been executed perfectly. The Bennett family would survive. She wasn't cruel enough to destroy them completely, but they would survive diminished, humbled, and forever aware that the woman they'd kicked out had been the only thing standing between them and irrelevance. She typed a final message to her chief financial officer. Establish a trust fund for the child. Oh, full protection from both maternal and paternal family access until age 25. Education and medical fully funded. And make sure Christopher receives monthly statements showing exactly what his child has that he signed away. Then Olivia Morrison Bennett, soon to be just Olivia Morrison again, closed her eyes and let herself rest, her hand protectively curved over her pregnant belly, knowing that when her child was born, it would enter a world where its mother had already taught everyone around them the most important lesson of all. Never mistake quiet strength for weakness, never confuse generosity with stupidity, and never ever underestimate the woman who's been holding your world together while you were too arrogant to notice. In the hallway outside, Christopher Bennett stood with his back against the wall, and his sister beside him in similar posture, both of them staring at their phones as the notifications continued to flood in. Account freezes, contract cancellations, legal threats, and professional divorces from everyone who'd benefited from association with the Bennett name. And for the first time in his life, Christopher understood what it meant to lose something irreplaceable. Not because it was taken from him, but because he'd thrown it away with his own hands, never recognizing its value until the moment it was gone forever. The trembling had started in his hands, but now it spread through his entire body. The physical manifestation of fear that came from understanding he'd gambled everything on a lie. The lie that he was the powerful one, the successful one, and the one who'd married down instead of up, and he'd lost in the most devastating way possible. Somewhere in the hospital, his wife carried his child, and somewhere in the world, that wife controlled an empire that could bankrupt him with a phone call or save him with the same. And Christopher Bennett, who'd handed divorce papers to his pregnant wife while his mistress mocked her and his sister called her a leech, now understood that the only question left was whether Olivia Morrison would be merciful enough to let him survive the ruins of what he'd destroyed.